What did I learn? I learned that teaching is not just, it's anything but the transmission of knowledge, however valuable. It's the effective transmission. And that transmission puts on the teacher the responsibility to be, as I've sometimes put it, capable of the histrionic, a good actor.
Well, first of all, may I say what a privilege it is to be able to speak about the late Emeritus Professor Louis Waller, who has had such an impact on the criminal law and the law more widely. I, for one, started as a student, a 17-year-old in 1968. He delivered the very first university lecture I sat in on. It was absolutely riveting.
Well, Louis taught me evidence, and he was engaging, entertaining, challenging, sometimes terrifying. He would roam the lecture theatre and occasionally fire off questions.
He adopted the full Socratic method. He had, of course, photographs and seating plans, and he would call on people, and so you couldn't escape his attention by sitting up the back of the class. Everything was innovative and exciting, and he made the criminal law live.
We were taught the Queen against Dudley and Stevens fairly early on. That's the case about the people who eat the cabin boy because they've been cast adrift. So that's a fascinating case. I go to the lecture and then I go to the tutorial. And at the start of the tutorial, Louis, who was my tutor, said a particular event relevant to the Dudley and Stevens case happened in 1839. What other important event happened in that year? We're all totally bemused, had no idea. It turned out to be it was the launch of the voyage of the Beagle with Charles Darwin on board. And we spent most of the tutorial discussing the implications of Darwin and the theory of evolution and what an intellectual revolution that involved. And I would attribute to, I mean, it's the only tutorial I remember from my university days, and I attribute to that tutorial specifically the sense that I always had at Monash, which is that law is deeply embedded in society. It's not just a force that hovers over the top sending down lightning bolts.
Professor Waller's latest investigation is centred on the issues of frozen embryos and surrogate mothers and their legal rights.
Professor Louis Waller is due to release his final report on the social, ethical and legal questions facing the legislators.
What do you feel in your own heart should happen here?
Well, I think the answer to that depends upon reflection upon the Waller Committee report. After all, Professor Waller has had the benefit of the submissions and advice and indeed participation of theologians, philosophers and the community who've been consulted in his inquiry.
It's probably very difficult for us now to appreciate the magnitude of what he did, but back then there had been no IVF babies. Medical science was racing ahead, particularly here in Australia, but there were no laws governing what would happen in the process of the procedures. And this was not a matter of dealing with human body parts, this was about life itself, something of which Professor Waller was acutely conscious. He had to grapple with the difficult questions of what will happen to leftover embryos. When does life begin? He had to deal with balancing religious views very carefully across his committee. Ultimately, he delivered a report that recommended legislation. That legislation was introduced in Victoria and became a world first. It was a national and international exemplar for the legal framework for fertility generally. In addition to all the other great things he did, he was a truly great Australian in that achievement alone.
It's a perennial problem, right, that science develops faster than the law can ever catch up. What was your view?
That's nonsense. That's, I mean, that's, if I may say so, that's a catch cry. The law works as fast as lawmakers want it to work.
Look, I'm deeply saddened this morning. I have learned of the death of a very important Victorian, Professor Louis Waller was the Law Reform Commissioner. He was the driving force behind Victoria's world first IVF laws. As one of my producers said this morning, wow, I wouldn't have kids if it wasn't for him.
Oh.
And a lot of people, if you've ever used IVF or you know anyone who's used IVF or you think IVF is a good thing, you've got Louis Waller to thank. He was also, over decades, an iconic figure at the Monash University Law School and taught generations of Monash graduates, and sadly he's died overnight, but he will be much remembered, and his chalk-covered blue blazer should be put in a glass box and displayed in the foyer of the law school. We were all so scared of him.
To me, he really exemplifies what an academic should be, engaged with impactful research, rigorous and insightful research that's of real-world impact. With colleagues here at Monash, we all would hope to continue his legacy and try to exemplify the same values and qualities that he did in his work.
I was very privileged to do work with Professor Waller when he became the Victorian Law Reform Commissioner. That was in the early 1980s. I had not seen him for quite some years since I graduated. I was sure I was just another student in the mix and not one of his top students to be written up and remembered forever. When I engaged with him at that time, he welcomed me into his office and made me feel very, very special.
I've forgotten most of my lecturers, I've forgotten most of what I learnt at law school, but I've never forgotten Louis' classes.
He embodied so much of the spirit of the Monash Law School: rigorous scholarship, passionate teaching, and that engagement with the profession, with reform of the law, particularly for those of us involved in criminal justice. And we can only hope to, in some small way, honour that legacy in our work. He was a great man.
What are you most proud of?
I've been asked this question several times. I have to say, on one occasion I was asked in a slightly different form, is the IVF work that you did what you're most proud of? And I said no. What I'm most proud of is that I was given the responsibility to teach for a large number of years to people at various stages of their legal studies, including postgraduate studies. And then there's a little voice in the background, clear as a bell, coming from the lady who is currently doing whatever she's doing. And she said very quietly, I thought the most important thing you ever did was to get me to marry you. I immediately went into complete confession and avoidance mode and said, of course, I was talking about my professional. I don't think it washed. What do you reckon?